I don't want to breathe the same air as this trash. Get her out of my sight before I do it myself. That was my stepbrother, Colton Hale, saying that to a flight attendant while pointing at his own sister like I was a stain on the carpet. His wife, Presley, had her phone raised and angled just right, filming me the way people film car accidents, already smiling at the thought of the views this would get her. I sat there and let the words land on me the way rain lands on a roof. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I looked at the seat back in front of me and I waited for my pulse to answer back. And it never did, because I had trained my body a long time ago not to answer people like him. My name is Danielle Rourke. I'm 28 years old, and 11 minutes before that moment, all I had done wrong was reach under my seat for a bag that didn't belong in first class, according to my brother, and didn't belong to a person like me, according to my brother's wife. What none of them understood yet was that the woman they were trying to humiliate in front of 40 strangers had spent the last 6 years doing a job that most people in that cabin couldn't have survived for 6 days. They would understand soon enough. But first, you should understand how we got here, because a story like this doesn't start on an airplane. It starts in a house in Millbrook, Ohio, in a kitchen with a linoleum floor that never quite got clean no matter how many times I scrubbed it. Back when I was a kid, nobody in that family actually wanted. If you're new to this channel, welcome. I tell stories about family, about the ones who forget where they came from, and the ones who never forget, and I ask that you consider this. The people who raised you don't always deserve the loyalty they demand from you. Sometimes the family you owe nothing to is the family that raised you. Sit with that while I tell you what happened at 31,000 feet, and what happened 12 years before that, in a kitchen that still visits me some nights when I can't sleep. Colton was never my brother by blood. His father married my mother when I was 7. After my own father drank himself out of our lives so completely that even his name feels like a stranger's name to me now. Colton's father, Richard Hale, owned 3 car dealerships and a piece of a bank, and he made sure everyone in a 50-mile radius knew it. When he married my mother, he didn't marry a family. He acquired a project. My mother became the woman who managed his household and smiled at his golf friends, and I became the leftover daughter nobody had budgeted for, the one who ate dinner a half step behind everyone else at the table because there was an order to things in that house, and I was always last in it. Colton was 2 years older than me, and from the very first week, he understood the arrangement better than I did. He understood that his father's love was a resource with limited supply, and that every kind word given to me was a kind word he didn't get. So he made sure I got as few as possible. He'd tell his father I broke things I never touched. He'd tell his friends I was the housekeeper's kid, which wasn't even true, just cruel for the sake of being cruel, because cruelty was a language he was fluent in by the age of 10. I used to think, when I was young enough to still hope for things, that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, proved myself useful enough, Richard Hale would look at me the way he looked at his own son. I made honor roll every single year. I ran track. I got a scholarship offer to study engineering at Ohio State. A full ride, the kind of thing a family is supposed to throw a party over. I brought that letter into Richard's study myself. I remember the room smelled like leather and pipe tobacco, and I remember my hands were shaking so badly the paper made a sound against itself, like dry leaves. Richard read maybe the first line. Then Colton, who'd followed me in without asking, snatched it out of his father's hands, laughed at it like it was a joke someone had written for his entertainment, and set it on fire with the lighter he used for his cigarettes. I watched my full ride to college curl into ash in a crystal dish on my stepfather's desk, and Richard didn't even look up from his ledger. "Congratulations," Colton said, dropping the burnt corner of my future onto the floor near my shoe. "Guess you'll be needing a real job." 3 weeks later, I turned 18, and Richard sat me down and explained, in the calm and reasonable voice men like him use when they want cruelty to sound like policy, that there wasn't room in the family budget to support a stepdaughter through college when there was a real son to invest in. Colton got a Lexus for his 18th birthday and a paid internship at the dealership. I got a suitcase set, a $50 bill, and a ride to the bus station. Nobody came outside to say goodbye. I sat on that bus with my forehead against the cold window, and I promised myself something I have kept every single day since. I was never going to beg that family for anything again. Not their money, not their approval, not even their acknowledgement that I existed. I was going to build something they couldn't burn. I enlisted in the United States Army 11 days later. I'm not going to pretend the next few years were some tidy movie montage. Basic training broke me down in ways I didn't know I could be broken, and it built me back up in ways I didn't know I needed. I found out I was good at things nobody in Millbrook, Ohio ever thought to ask if I was good at. I could read terrain. I could stay calm when other people's hands were shaking. I could take a hit, physical or otherwise, and keep my face still while I decided what to do about it. A skill I'd actually been practicing since I was 7 years old at that dinner table. I just hadn't known it had a name yet. Command noticed. I went through selection for a specialized combat support role that I'm still not able to discuss the specifics of, not because I'm being dramatic about it, but because I signed paperwork that means exactly what it says. What I can tell you is that for the last 4 years, I've deployed with a unit most Americans have never heard of and never will, doing work that occasionally puts my name on a short list of people the Pentagon keeps very close track of. 2 years ago, outside a checkpoint near a collapsed apartment block in a city I still can't name out loud, I was part of a small team that got 3 American contractors out of a building that was actively coming down around us. I don't talk about what that day cost me. I have a scar that runs from my collarbone to the middle of my back that I don't show people, and I have 3 names I say to myself sometimes late at night, names of people who didn't walk away from that block the way I did. What I got in return for that day, months later, in a quiet room with no cameras, was a small piece of ribbon and a case that I keep in a drawer I don't open very often because it isn't a trophy. It's a weight. Command also gave me something else after that deployment. 6 days of leave and a plane ticket home, the first time I'd been back to the United States in 11 months. I wasn't flying home to Millbrook. I hadn't spoken to Richard or Colton in almost 10 years. I was flying to Washington, D.C., because in 3 days, in a private ceremony that very few people are ever told about, I was going to be one of 4 service members receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, one rank below the Medal of Honor, for what happened that day at the checkpoint. My mother had passed 2 years earlier, quietly, from a heart that I think had been breaking slowly since long before I left home, and I was, as far as I knew, the only family I had left who mattered. I hadn't planned on seeing Colton at all. Fate, or maybe just the cruelty of a shared layover system, had other plans. I was flying out of Seattle, connecting through to Dulles in my one nice dress, a plain navy blue one I'd bought for exactly this trip because I didn't own a single piece of civilian clothing that wasn't either athletic gear or something I'd wear to a funeral. I wore my old canvas rucksack instead of a suitcase because it was simply what I traveled with, government issue, faded, the fabric worn soft in places from years of being thrown into helicopters and Humvees and cargo holds. Underneath my seat, my boots, because my feet had been trained by years of deployment to distrust anything without ankle support, especially on a 9-hour travel day. I know how that looked. I know exactly how a woman in a discount dress and combat boots, carrying an army surplus bag, looks to people who measure worth by the label on your shoes. I have never once cared. I'd upgraded to first class using points I'd banked over 3 deployments and never had the chance to spend. A small gift to myself before I stood in front of a general and let him pin something heavy to my chest. I settled into seat 2A, tucked my rucksack under the seat in front of me, and closed my eyes. And I did not clock until the boarding music had already changed and the cabin was filling with the low murmur of people finding their seats. That seat, 2C, belonged to Colton Hale. He hadn't changed. Bigger through the shoulders from whatever gym membership his father's money was currently funding, more expensive watch, same exact face he'd had at 16 when he set my future on fire in a crystal dish, that particular blend of boredom and contempt that some men wear like cologne. Beside him was Presley, his wife, a woman I'd never met, dressed like she was attending a magazine shoot instead of a cross-country flight, diamond studs the size of chickpeas, already filming a boarding video for whatever platform she performed her life on. Colton saw me before I could decide whether to pretend I hadn't seen him. His whole face did something ugly and delighted at once, the expression of a man who has just been handed a toy he thought he'd lost. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, loud enough for the row behind us to hear. "Danielle, didn't know they let people like you fly up front these days." I didn't answer him. I have learned, in rooms far more dangerous than a first-class cabin, that silence is a weapon men like Colton have no training against. He needs a reaction to feed on. I decided, somewhere over the next 20 minutes, that he wasn't going to get one. He got worse the longer I stayed quiet. That's the pattern with people like him. My calm isn't peace to them. It's an insult. Proof I think I don't need to perform for their approval. By the time the seatbelt sign turned off after takeoff, he'd made 3 separate comments to Presley about the dress. My bag, my boots, loud enough for me to hear every word, each one landing exactly where he wanted it to land. Except it didn't land at all, because I had spent years training the parts of myself that used to flinch. Presley had her phone up the entire time, narrating for whoever was watching. "This is wild, you guys," she said at one point, barely bothering to lower her voice. "I don't even know how she got a seat back here." It was somewhere over Montana that Colton decided quiet contempt wasn't enough anymore. He wanted an audience. He wanted a performance. He stood up in the aisle, adjusted his blazer the way men do when they think a jacket gives them authority, and flagged down the flight attendant, a young man named Marcus who had the exhausted, professionally pleasant look of someone who has already had a long day and knows it's about to get longer. "Excuse me," Colton said, pitching his voice for the whole cabin. "This is a first-class cabin. I don't think this woman's ticket is actually valid up here. Can you check?" Marcus, to his credit, looked more confused than anything. "Sir, I can check the manifest, but just check it," Colton said. Then, turning to me, delivering the line I know is the reason you're watching this video, the line that started everything. "I don't want to breathe the same air as this trash. Get her out of my sight before I do it myself." The cabin went quiet in that specific way. A room goes quiet when everyone suddenly understands they're watching something they shouldn't look away from. Presley lifted her phone a little higher, angling for a better shot of my face, hoping, I think, to catch tears, or begging, or the kind of collapse she could caption with something cruel and get 100,000 likes for by the time we landed. I gave her nothing. I looked at my brother, and I let 4 full seconds pass in total silence, and then I said, in a voice I kept level and quiet on purpose, because the loudest thing in a room is sometimes the person who refuses to raise their voice. "Sit down, Colton. You're embarrassing yourself." That was the wrong thing to say to a man who has never once in his life been told no and made to sit with it. His face went a shade of red I remembered from childhood, the color that meant the next thing out of his mouth was going to be worse than the last. He leaned over, into my space, close enough that I could smell the airport bourbon on his breath, and he grabbed the strap of my rucksack, yanking it up from under the seat in front of me like he intended to throw it into the aisle himself. "Get this trailer trash bag off my flight," he said, and I felt something in me go very, very still, the same stillness I feel in the seconds before a door gets kicked in, the stillness where instinct takes over faster than thought. I didn't lunge. I didn't shout. I reached up, calm as anything, and closed my hand around his wrist, at the exact pressure point I've been trained to find blind. In the dark, on a moving target, and I applied just enough force to make his fingers open on their own. He let go of the bag with a short, surprised yelp that didn't match the size of him at all, more startled than actually hurt. Though I promise you it would have been considerably worse if I'd wanted it to be. He stumbled back a step into the aisle, cradling his wrist, staring at me now with something underneath the anger that I recognized immediately, because I've seen it on faces in far more serious circumstances than an airplane cabin. It was fear. Presley screamed like I'd pulled a knife on him, instead of simply declining to be manhandled. "Someone call the police," she shouted at Marcus, at the cabin, at nobody in particular. "She just attacked him. Assault! Somebody's filming this? I hope somebody's filming this!" I straightened my dress where it had shifted, set my rucksack back exactly where it belonged, and sat down, hands folded in my lap, heart rate somewhere around 50 beats a minute, because whatever this was, it wasn't the kind of danger that raises mine anymore. Marcus, wisely, did not call the police. He called the flight deck. The cockpit door unlocked with that particular heavy mechanical sound that makes an entire cabin go quiet out of sheer instinct, and the captain stepped out. He introduced himself as Captain Reyes, mid-50s, the kind of face that spent 30 years reading rooms full of tension from the front of an airplane. His eyes went first to Colton, red-faced and cradling his wrist like a wounded man in a war movie, then to Presley, still filming, then to me, sitting perfectly straight, perfectly calm, in my navy dress and my worn-out boots. "Someone want to explain what's going on back here?" he said, in the voice of a man who has broken up 100 disputes like this and expects this one to be exactly as boring as the last 99. "Captain, thank God." Colton said immediately, straightening up, performing the victim now with the same practiced ease he'd performed the tyrant 30 seconds earlier. This woman assaulted me. I want her removed from this flight immediately. I want her met by police the second we land. I'm a platinum member of this airline. I fly this route every single week, and I am not going to sit here and be attacked by some. He stopped himself right before the word came out, but everyone in earshot understood exactly what word he'd swallowed. Captain Reyes didn't even look at him fully. His eyes had drifted, almost involuntarily, to my rucksack, half open now from where Colton had yanked at it, the faded canvas flap fallen to one side, exposing what I always keep folded just inside the top pocket. Not hidden, never hidden, just private. My military identification, and beside it, wrapped in a soft cloth because I don't like it rattling loose, the small velvet case I'd been carrying to Washington. The lid had slipped open in the scuffle. Inside, unmistakable even from 3 feet away, was the metal. I watched Captain Reyes's whole posture change. It happened in about a second and a half. A shift so complete it was like watching a different man step into his uniform, his shoulders squared. His chin came up. He looked at me the way you look at someone you suddenly understand you've been standing too casually in front of. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had dropped into something entirely different now, something careful. "Is that a Distinguished Service Cross?" The cabin, which had been a low murmur of whispers and craning necks, went absolutely silent. I didn't answer right away. I have never needed to explain myself to people who spent their whole lives assuming a woman in cheap boots had nothing worth explaining. I simply reached down, closed the flap of my bag with 2 fingers, and looked back up at him. "Yes, sir," I said. "It is." Colton actually laughed. A short, disbelieving bark of a laugh. The sound of a man still too far inside his own certainty to understand the ground had already shifted under him. "That's a costume prop or something, right?" he said. To Presley, to the cabin, to anyone who'd validate him. "She probably bought that off the internet." Captain Reyes didn't dignify that with a response. He was already reaching for the handset mounted near the galley, and I heard him speaking low and fast into it, words I recognized immediately from years of hearing exactly this kind of call made about exactly this kind of situation, except usually I was the one being radioed about, not the one sitting quietly while it happened. He requested ground coordination. He used a phrase I won't repeat here because it isn't mine to repeat, a phrase that exists specifically for situations involving personnel like me, personnel whose travel occasionally intersects with protocols most passengers never learn exist. Colton's bravado didn't survive the next 4 minutes. I watched it die in real time, watched him look around the cabin for an ally and find none, watched Presley slowly lower her phone as the reality of what she'd been filming started to reframe itself in her head, watched the businessman in 3A, who'd been pretending to read his tablet through the entire scene, glance at Colton with something close to disgust. "You don't understand who I am," Colton tried, once, weakly, to Captain Reyes's retreating back. "I own 3 car dealerships. I'm worth more than this entire airplane." Captain Reyes turned around just long enough to say 4 words that I will remember for the rest of my life, delivered without a trace of anger, just flat, total finality. "Sir, I don't care." We landed at Dulles 19 minutes later. I know because I watched the clock, because time behaves strangely for me in tense rooms, an old habit from a career where seconds get counted for reasons that have nothing to do with airplane delays. What waited for us on the tarmac was not the local police that Presley had been so eager to summon for her video. 2 black government SUVs sat parked at the base of the jet bridge, engines running, and beside them stood a woman in dress uniform I recognized instantly, because I'd spoken to her on the phone 11 days earlier about ceremony logistics, Colonel Ashworth, the officer overseeing my award ceremony, who had apparently been informed, somewhere over Ohio, that one of her honorees had been involved in an incident requiring her personal attention. The doors opened before the seatbelt sign had even gone off. Colonel Ashworth walked up that jet bridge with 2 junior officers behind her, moving with the unhurried, absolute authority of someone who has never once in her career needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. And she stepped into that cabin, found me instantly among 40 passengers without a moment's hesitation, and did something that made the entire first-class cabin go rigid with confusion. She saluted me. I stood, because you stand, because some things are simply wired into you deeper than fear or fatigue or 12 years of being told you don't matter, and I returned it, crisp and correct, my hand cutting the exact line. It's cut 10,000 times in training and in places I can't discuss. Sergeant First Class Rourke, Colonel Ashworth said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, her eyes flicking once, briefly, to Colton, who had gone the color of old paper. We were told there was a disturbance involving one of our honorees. I take it this is the gentleman responsible. Colton opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out of it. Colonel Ashworth didn't wait for him to find words. She turned to Captain Reyes instead, spoke a few quiet sentences I couldn't fully hear, and then turned back to the cabin at large, and I watched her deliver, with perfect, unhurried calm, the kind of public accounting I have wanted, somewhere underneath 20 years of training myself not to want it, since I was 17 years old watching a scholarship letter burn in a crystal dish. This woman, Colonel Ashworth said, gesturing toward me, and her voice carried to every row without her needing to raise it, is being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross in 3 days for actions that saved the lives of 3 American citizens under fire. She has given more to this country in the last 6 years than most people give in a lifetime. And she spent the last 4 hours of a commercial flight being called trash by her own family for the crime of sitting in a seat she paid for. Nobody in that cabin made a sound. Presley had lowered her phone completely now, staring at the screen like it had betrayed her, which, in a way, it had. Because everything she'd filmed for an audience she wanted to shock was now going to be evidence of exactly the opposite thing she'd intended. Colton tried one more time, voice small in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before. Colonel, with respect, she attacked me. I have a bruise. I can show you. You grabbed federal property containing classified materials and a service member's personal decorations, Colonel Ashworth said, and something in her tone made even the junior officers behind her go very still, be grateful all she did was make you let go of it. I stood there, in my navy dress and my worn combat boots, my rucksack over one shoulder, and I watched 12 years of quiet compress into about 90 seconds. I didn't smile. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve a satisfying ending tied up with a bow. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. The specific tiredness that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally being allowed, for just a moment, to set it down. Colonel Ashworth's officers escorted Colton and Presley off the aircraft first, separately from the rest of the passengers, through a side door that led not toward baggage claim, but toward an administrative office where, I later learned, Colton spent 45 minutes being interviewed about interfering with federal personnel, a conversation that did not go the way 3 car dealerships and a piece of a bank had ever prepared him to have. He was not arrested. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a story about revenge dressed up as justice. It's a story about the specific, quiet humiliation of finally being seen clearly by people whose opinion actually carries weight, after a lifetime of being dismissed by people whose opinion never should have mattered as much as it did. The rest of the cabin applauded when I finally walked up the aisle to disembark. I didn't ask for that. I want you to know that too. I nodded once, the way you nod at strangers who've witnessed something private become public, and I kept walking, and Captain Reyes stood at the cockpit door as I passed and said only, "Ma'am, thank you for your service." And I said, "Thank you for yours," because keeping a plane full of frightened people calm is its own kind of service, and I've learned not to let anyone's contribution go unspoken, even the quiet ones, even the ones nobody puts a medal on. 3 days later, in a room with far fewer people in it than that airplane cabin had held, wearing my dress uniform instead of a navy dress from a discount rack, I stood at attention while a 2-star general read a citation describing the worst day of my professional life in the flattest, most official language imaginable, and pinned a small piece of metal and ribbon to my chest that will never, ever feel as heavy as it looked in that velvet case. My mother wasn't there to see it. Nobody from Millbrook, Ohio was there to see it. And for the first time in my entire life, I understood, standing perfectly straight in that quiet room, that this was exactly how it should be. Some things you do because you're chasing someone's approval, and some things you do simply because they are right. And the doing of them is the whole reward. And anyone who shows up late to notice doesn't get to share in what it cost you to earn it. I haven't spoken to Colton since that flight. I heard, through the thin, persistent thread of small-town gossip that never fully cuts no matter how far you move, that the dealership lost a modest but embarrassing contract not long after, something about a federal fleet account that suddenly, quietly, wasn't renewed, though I genuinely don't know if the two things are connected and I've made a point of not asking. I don't need the universe to hand me a tidy revenge arc. I got something better on that airplane. I got to watch a man who spent 20 years making sure I understood exactly how little I mattered, finally, publicly, undeniably, understand how wrong he'd been, in front of the one audience his money and his name had never once been able to buy. If you're watching this and you carry something similar, a family that made you feel small so they could feel large, a household where love was something you had to compete for and still lost, I want you to hear this clearly. Because it took me until I was 28 years old and standing on a tarmac in Washington, D.C., to learn it myself. You do not owe your loyalty to people simply because they share your blood or your last name or your childhood address. Family isn't the people who happen to raise you. Family is the people who show up, quietly, consistently, without asking to be thanked for it. Build your worth somewhere they can't reach it and can't burn it down, and one day, you won't need them in the room to know exactly who you are. If this story meant something to you, stay a while longer, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. There's another story waiting for you right after this one, and I promise you it's just as true as this one felt.